So I have built a lot of cabinets over the years, from huge shop projects to built-ins to entire kitchens, and I've built those cabinets with a ton of different tools using everything from a job site table saw all the way up to a huge CNC. And in this video, I'm gonna kind of go over my process of building cabinets, the style that I've kind of landed on, and what I found to be the most efficient way to build cabinets. So the first step in any cabinetry project is figuring out exactly how many cabinets you're gonna need and what size your cabinetry install is gonna be. So I start by taking some measurements in my space, figure out what the total run of cabinets is gonna be, and then I hop into SketchUp to start designing the actual cabinets I'm gonna be building. So one of the first decisions you're gonna need to make when building cabinets is to decide which style of cabinet you're gonna build, because really there's two popular styles. There are face frame cabinets and frameless or Euro cabinets. And I build pretty much exclusively frameless cabinets. I think they're easier to build. I like the way they look better. It's just what I go with. But that being said, if you like face frame cabinets, the construction of the cabinet boxes doesn't really change that much between the two. So you can just as easily follow along with this video and add face frames to these cabinet boxes, and you'll end up with a similar result. So the next thing to figure out is what exact cabinets you're gonna be building. And typically these are gonna be broken up into two different styles. You've got your base cabinets, which are installed on the floor, and then you've got your upper cabinets, which are installed on the wall. As far as common dimensions, base cabinets are typically 34.5 inches tall. So that way when you add an 1.5 inch countertop, you end up with a 36-inch working height, which is comfortable for most people. And then the depth on your base cabinets is typically gonna be 2 feet. For your upper cabinets, the depth is typically gonna be about 1 foot. You can go a little bit deeper depending on your applications, but 1 foot is the standard. And then height is gonna vary depending on the height of the ceilings in your space. If you've got super short ceilings, you can do 30-inch tall uppers. If you've got standard 8-foot ceilings, you can go 36 inches. If you've got really tall ceilings, you can go 42 inches, and really the sky's the limit. But you gotta think that if you go much higher than 42 inches, you're gonna have to get out a step ladder to access anything in the top of those cabinets. So depending on your application, I would typically stop at 42 inches. So as far as your cabinet widths, that's really gonna depend on the space you're gonna be installing these cabinets. And commercially available cabinets typically come in about 3-inch increments, starting around 15 inches. You can get 12-inch wide cabinets, but that's not a ton of room realistically. So unless you've got kind of an awkward configuration, I would recommend a minimum of a 15-inch wide cabinet, and moving up from there, you can do 18, 21, 24, 27, and I would kind of stop there width-wise, because you start to get these really awkward sized cabinets, because not only do the cabinets start to get pretty hard to move at that point because they're so big, but you get these huge massive drawers that are very hard to organize. So really I think some of the only applications for larger than 27-inch base cabinets or upper cabinets are for things like sink bases, which are usually 30 inches or 36 inches depending on the size of your sink. One other big tip here is if you're using plywood from the big box store, which is gonna be exactly 4 foot by 8 foot, you're gonna wanna make your cabinet sides for your base cabinets about 23 3/4 of an inch, just to give you a little bit of extra wiggle room so you can rip off those factory edges to get a nice clean edge. And then for your upper cabinets, it's the same thing. You probably wanna make those 11 3/4 deep rather than that full 12 inches, because otherwise you're not gonna get 4 side panels out of 1 sheet of plywood. And during this design process, when I'm mocking things up in SketchUp, I like to just start with big boxes rather than trying to perfectly model the entire cabinet initially, because then I can figure out what combination of cabinet sizes are gonna work. And then once I have that figured out, I can start to model in all of the detailed parts once the sizes are worked out. So once you have your design nailed down, you can start to figure out your construction methods. And there are a ton of different options when it comes to this. And I think this is really what tripped me up initially, because everybody seems to build cabinets a little bit differently using their own methods. And really a lot of that's gonna come down to what kind of tools you have at your disposal, where you're getting your materials and hardware, and how you want your finished cabinet install to end up looking. So we'll start with base cabinets, and typically those are gonna have a full bottom panel and full side panels, and that's just gonna give those cabinets a ton of strength. But then for the top and the back of the cabinet boxes, you can typically get away with using stretchers, because those tops and backs are never gonna be seen in the finished install. The tops are gonna be covered by your countertop, and if your base cabinets are gonna be filled with drawers, you're never gonna see the back either. And so using these kind of stretchers will save you a ton of material, so it's gonna keep your costs down, and it will make the finished cabinets a lot lighter weight, so it'll make them a lot easier when it comes to installing them. A couple situations where you might want a full back panel on your base cabinets is if it's a door base, and when you open those doors, you'll obviously be able to see the back of the cabinet, so you might want to do a full back panel in that case. Another common base cabinet is going to be your sink base, and you can really go either way with your back panels there. If your plumbing is coming out of your wall, I would recommend still doing these nailers because it's going to make it a lot easier when you go to install the cabinets without having to mangle the back panel to get all that plumbing through. The other big consideration when you're building base cabinets is the toe kick. And in case you don't know, this is that little area that's notched out at the bottom of the cabinet, so when you're standing at your countertop, your toes have somewhere to go instead of kicking the front of the cabinets. And so traditionally these toe kicks have just been notched out of the side panels, but I personally really don't like building cabinets in that style. It adds an extra step during the cutting process that can be kind of tricky depending on what tools you have access to. It also makes the assembly process a little bit more difficult because you have to inset that bottom panel flush with that notched out area. And I don't think it's as efficient from a material standpoint because let's say, for example, you want to get multiple side panels out of a sheet of plywood. Well, if your panel's 34.5 inches tall, you're not going to get 3 full rows of side panels out of your sheet of plywood. So instead of an integrated toe kick, I'd highly recommend using a separate toe kick system, whether that's leveling feet or building a separate base, because then you can cut your side panels to 30 inches tall and you're gonna get 3 full rows of side panels, 6 total side panels out of 1 sheet of plywood, so it's very efficient from a material standpoint. I typically use a combination of leveling feet and a ledger board for my base cabinets, and I find this makes installation way easier. You attach the ledger board to your wall 4.5 inches up from the ground. You've got your 2 leveling feet on the front of each cabinet. All you have to do is set your cabinet boxes in place, twist those leveling feet to get the cabinet level, and you're pretty much good to go. But if you don't want to spend the money on leveling feet or having a hard time sourcing those, you can certainly just build a separate toe kick base out of some scraps of plywood or 2x4s or whatever. Get that base installed nice and level, and then you can sit your cabinet boxes on top of that base in the same exact way, and you're still going to make your installation process a heck of a lot easier and get a lot more efficient yield out of your plywood. Now, when it comes to upper cabinets, those are typically a lot simpler because pretty much every upper cabinet is gonna have doors on it. You're gonna want a full back panel. So again, you can use a solid 3/4 inch back panel if you wanna simplify the joinery, or you can use nailers and that 1/4 inch back panel if you wanna save a little material and weight. Upper cabinets are also gonna have solid top panels rather than stretchers because again, you're gonna be able to see those when you open the doors of the cabinet. So once you've figured out your construction style, you can either model up your cabinets in something like SketchUp, or you can just draw them out and estimate your materials that way. One reason I love using SketchUp personally is because there is a free plugin called CutList that will generate a cut list, as the name implies, a cutting diagram, which will show me how to efficiently get all of the parts out of a 4x8 sheet of plywood. And that cutting diagram helps me come up with my bill of materials because I'll know exactly how many sheets of plywood I need to buy for the project. And this is also what I use to make the plans for all of my projects. So if you guys have ever bought any of my plans, just know that I worked through those plans when I was building the actual thing. So the plans are usually very, very accurate. And I'll definitely have plans for this big miter saw station project that I'm working on right now, which has a ton of this cabinetry built in. And so this is what that finished cut list and cutting diagram looks like. And then I just print them out and I'm ready to go out into the shop to start breaking down my material. So there are obviously a lot of different ways to break down sheet goods. You can definitely use a circular saw with some sort of straight edge. If you're gonna be doing that, I would definitely upgrade your blade to a higher tooth count blade that's designed for cutting plywood. Otherwise, you're gonna get a ton of tear out and are gonna have a pretty bad time. If you wanna upgrade a little bit from a circular saw, you could get a track saw, and I'm actually testing out the cheapest track saw on Amazon as we speak against some of my Festool track saws just to see how they compete, so I can recommend those to you guys if they do well. And so far, I am pretty dang impressed. So I don't think there's much of a reason not to own a track saw these days. You can get them for like $100, and I think they're one of the first tools any woodworker should add to their tool arsenal. Obviously, if you have a table saw, those are also excellent for breaking down sheet goods, and that's how I broke down all the parts for this project. And the number one thing I'm keeping in mind the entire time I'm breaking down all of these plywood parts is that I want to remove those factory edges so I get nice, clean, straight, square edges to all my pieces, which is gonna make the assembly process a lot easier. So as I mentioned earlier, I undersized the depth of my side panels so that I have plenty of room to rip off that factory edge. And as you can see, when I'm making these cuts, I'm roughly cutting that first side panel to height, adding about 1/2 inch to my length there, so then I can flip that whole thing over and cut off that factory edge from both of those side panels in one go. And one thing I should mention here is that the order you make these cuts can definitely change based on whether you're going to be adding edge banding to your parts or not. Because if you are going to be adding edge banding, it can make that process a lot more efficient if you make your long rip cuts first, add your edge banding to that entire long edge, and then cross cut all of your panels to size after you've added the edge banding, so then you know that edge banding is going to be perfect on all of those pieces. Now that being said, if you're just using iron-on edge banding, it can be a little bit tricky to get a nice, perfect 8-foot long run of edge banding. And even with the little heat gun edge banding setup I have, I know it would not really work with those larger panels very easily. So I still cut all of my panels to final size before adding edge banding. But again, that's just gonna depend on your process. For this project, again, this is a miter saw station. I'm not gonna be adding any edge banding, so I went ahead and cross-cut all my pieces first, and then I ripped them down to final size after cross-cutting all the pieces. And this allowed me to rip all my panels down to their finished size with one fence setting, so I know they're all gonna match up perfectly. And also that way I could make sure I ripped off all those factory edges. But first ripping the larger part into multiple pieces, and then ripping off that factory edge, cutting the part to final size. And this might seem like a lot to keep track of if you've never built cabinets before, but I think after the first couple pieces, it'll just kind of become second nature. And you can definitely use a pencil or some painter's tape to keep track of which factory edge hasn't been cut off yet. But for me, I just keep all my parts and pieces oriented in the same way. So that way I know when I go to cut that panel to final size, the factory edge is getting cut off. Now the other thing I should mention is that the cutting diagrams that SketchUp spits out also include all of the stretchers, but I typically will just come back and cut all of those out of the scraps or offcuts from the project once I've cut all the side panels to size. And by doing that for this project, I was able to save about a half a sheet of plywood, and it kept me from throwing away all these little bits and pieces that otherwise wouldn't have been particularly useful. And as far as sizing for these nailers or stretchers, you might notice that some of these are different sizes. And again, that just depended on what size of scrap I ended up with. But usually these are gonna be in that 3 to 4 inch wide range, but you can definitely get away with going down to as narrow as something like 2.5 inches, especially for those stretchers and nailers at the back corners of the cabinet, because they're gonna be stacked up like this in the finished build anyway. So even this 2.5 inch stretcher is gonna have plenty of strength. So now that we have all of our cabinet parts and pieces cut down to size, we can move on to assembly. And I think cabinet assembly is one of those things that you tend to overcomplicate when you're getting started. And I know I was definitely guilty of that. First of all, you do not need glue for your typical cabinet. I've not used any glue on my cabinetry projects for the last probably 4 years, and I've had 0 failures. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because while those few screws and nails might not be that strong for the individual cabinet, once you tie all of those cabinets together in the run and screw them all to your wall, a lot of that load is going to be transferred to the wall, to the ground, and to the other cabinets. So each individual cabinet does not need to be bomb-proof to make for a very strong bank of cabinets. The other thing to consider is if you're using something like pre-finished plywood or laminate, the glue is not gonna work anyway. So it's really not necessary, and I know that's gonna feel stressful to some of you guys who are first-time cabinet builders, but believe me, just put down the glue. It's gonna save you a lot of cleanup and hassle later on in the project. The other big, what I would consider no-no, and I know, again, I am very guilty of this, is that you do not need to use pocket holes for your cabinets unless the sides of the cabinets are gonna be visible in the finished install. If you think about a typical bank of cabinets, only 1 or 2 of those sides are gonna be visible, and on something like a built-in, none of the sides are gonna be visible. So if you can't see the sides in the finished installation, why waste all that time drilling all those pocket holes, make the assembly a lot more of a pain, because when you're driving in those pocket screws at an angle, it wants to pull those pieces out of alignment. So just ditch the pocket screws unless, again, it's maybe your last cabinet in the run, or it's a single cabinet and you want to hide the screws and nails. I can understand that. For me, none of my cabinet sides are visible in the finished install, no matter what type of cabinet configuration there is, and that's because I used what are called finished in panels. And all a finished in panel is, in the case of frameless cabinets, is another piece of plywood attached to the last cabinet in the run, usually screwed in place from the inside of the cabinet so you don't see those screws. And the other big advantage of a finished in panel is that you can scribe it to the wall or to your floor much more easily than trying to scribe your cabinet. So you don't have to add any kind of extra trim or molding or tons of caulk, that kind of thing. The other thing I do with my finished in panel is make the front edge of the in panel flush with the front of the drawer fronts, and that gives the finished cabinets this kind of inset look, but it allows you to get that inset look without having to go through all the hassle of actually building inset cabinets. So that's why I'm using finished in panels on pretty much all of my cabinetry projects moving forward, including this one. I've got some of this plywood with a really cool laminate on it that I'm going to use for my finished in, so I don't care if these side panels are full of nails or screw holes, because they're never going to be seen. So let's go ahead and get started building some of these cabinets. And so I like to start by just tacking all of my pieces together with either brad nails or Nair Crown staples. All these brad nails or Nair Crown staples are doing are temporarily holding these pieces together. And all they really need to do is hold the pieces in place until I come back and add screws to reinforce all the joints. So I typically start by attaching my bottom panel to one of my side panels. This just gives me a nice stable base to work with. And if you have a pretty flat workbench, this is as simple as taking the pieces, lining up your front edge, pushing everything down flat against your workbench, and then just tacking everything together. So that's it. This side panel is tacked in place now. I can repeat the process with the other side panel. And the other thing I should mention is that I'm using a brad nailer here just because I kind of want to try this new brad nailer I just got. But I do prefer Nair Crown staples because if you think about it, a Nair Crown staple is essentially 2 brad nails side by side, so you get twice the holding power. So on larger cabinet sides like this, it can keep them a little bit more stable until you go back to reinforce everything with screws. All right, so there is our 2 sides and bottom panel. So now we can start installing our stretchers and nailers since this is a base cabinet. And again, I like to use my workbench as my kind of flat reference surface. And so next I'll go ahead and add this back nailer and then the top stretchers. Once again, I'm gonna go ahead and use up one of these narrower stretchers here because the back edge of this cabinet is already supported by the nailer. And so it doesn't really matter that this stretcher is only 2.5 inches wide. And then the last piece to install is gonna be this front top stretcher. And then we can come back and reinforce everything with screws. And there you go. That is the assembled base cabinet. Obviously it's only tacked together, but you can see just how quickly that went. One other really nice thing is that I have this lift top workbench. So when I'm working on anything a little bit taller like this, rather than having to reach all the way up here to put in these screws, I can just drop down my workbench. So now I need to reinforce all of these joints with screws because these nails are definitely not strong enough. As you can see, this cabinet does still rack a little bit when I push on it, so obviously we don't want that. And when it comes to adding screws, this is a place where I differ from some of my other kind of pro cabinet making friends on YouTube. Their advice would be to pre-drill all of your holes, and that's definitely fine if you want to do that. It definitely will ensure that you never have any splitting. But if you think about just how many screws are in a typical cabinetry project, I would say there's probably at least 30 screws in each cabinet. So in this bank of like 12 upper and base cabinets, I've got like 400 screws. So rather than pre-drilling 400 holes, I like to use a certain type of screw, and they are these Spax MDF or hardwood screws. And this is not sponsored or anything. I buy these screws. They're my favorite cabinetry screw for a reason, and that's because they have this specialized tip. A lot of screws say that they pre-drill when you drive them in, but I don't think that's true in a lot of cases, but these definitely do. So this tip actually pre-drills the hole as you drive the screw, and so you do not need to pre-drill any of your holes. And I've used thousands of these. Actually, I'm about out of this 1 3/4. I need to buy another box. But as you can see, I'll just drive it in a little bit sub flush. Good to go. No splitting, super quick and simple. So obviously if you don't have access to these exact screws, pre-drilling is definitely a good idea, especially with a countersink bit, and I'll link to my favorite bit in the video description below. But I think you can get these screws at pretty much any Home Depot or on Amazon, and I think they are amazing. But the kind of rule of thumb for me is in each stretcher, at each end of each stretcher, I want to add 2 screws. And then where the side panels meet the bottom panel, or the top panels in the case of the wall cabinets, I typically add a screw every 6 to 8 inches or so. But as you can see, I'm just kind of working around every side systematically. It's very easy to miss things when you're building a lot of cabinets. So coming up with some kind of system really helps to just improve your efficiency and make sure all your cabinets end up the exact same. Once again, you want to connect this nailer to this bottom panel just for added strength, because as you can see, if you didn't do that, all of the weight of this cabinet attached to the wall would be hanging on just this stretcher. And by adding a few screws, you're going to transfer that load. Okay, so here's another example of why I like to tack these together initially with brad nails and then come back and reinforce them. When I was attaching this side to the bottom must have had just a little bit of a bow in it. So I flushed up the front and back edges, but this center section ended up just a hair proud. So all I gotta do, since it's just a couple brad nails, I'll go ahead and screw these corners together so they don't go anywhere. And then I could either clamp this down or I could just tap it with a mallet and see if that does it. Yep, there we go. Nice and flush. So then that's it. You've got your base cabinet fully assembled, and that took all of probably 15 minutes, and that included talking to the camera. The one other thing I like to do sometimes if I'm gonna have these kind of hanging around my shop for a while is attach a couple strips of plywood to the bottom here, just temporary scraps. I think I've heard this called skidders. It's really nice because with those two strips, you can then just set this base cabinet on the ground and drag it around your shop and not worry about damaging any of the edges of the plywood. And then you just pry them off at the end of the project. Oh, shoot. Pro tip, don't use 1.5-inch nails because they'll go right through. Dang it. They are very strong though. Oi, what a dingus. So building upper cabinets is pretty much the same process. The only real difference is rather than stretchers for the top, you're gonna have solid panels for the top. And so I'm gonna take one of my sides, one of my bottoms, same exact thing, one side, and then I'm gonna go ahead and add this bottom nailer. And then before adding the top nailer, I'm gonna go ahead and add the top panel to make sure that offset is correct. Now I can add the top nailer. And there's our upper cabinet. Exactly the same process as the base cabinet. The only difference is obviously the solid top panel. And then if you were gonna add a back panel, you would have slid that in prior to installing the top panel and then the nailers. And now I can come back and add these screws to reinforce all these connections and then just repeat the process for the rest of the upper cabinets. Okay, 1 down, 5 more to go. So as you can see, it did not take long at all to assemble all 6 of the base and upper cabinets. And now all it's left to do is drill all of the holes for mounting the hardware, get things sanded up, apply a little finish, and then it'll be time to install these things. So the only real hardware on these upper cabinets are gonna be the door hinges and then the shelf pins. And of course my shelf pin hole jig is at my house. So I'll just show you these door hinges. These are Blum soft close hinges. These are the overlay variety since these are gonna be overlay doors. And these are pretty simple to install if you have the right jigs, because you need to install the base plates for the hinges on the inside of the cabinets and then the rest of the hinges on the door. And installing these base plates is super simple. I have a couple of different jigs I can use here. These are for inset doors, these are for overlay doors. These are both from Rockler. You could certainly make your own jigs here, but these are nice acrylics. Really all you have to do is measure in and figure out where exactly you want the hinges, and there's really a lot of wiggle room there, but I typically go in about 4 inches because it matches up with the hinge drilling jig that I use for the doors. So all I need to do is measure in 4 inches, make a mark on either end, whoops. Then I can transfer that mark onto the inside face of the cabinet. Then all I need to do is take my jig, line it up with my mark, and then take a self-centering drill bit and drill out my mounting holes. And then all I would do is screw these base plates into the cabinet, and that's it. The hinge plates are installed. Once I drill the hinge cup holes into the doors, I haven't even cut the doors yet, but when I do, they'll just snap into place, and then you've got your soft closed doors, good to go. And that's pretty much it for the hardware on these upper cabinets, except for drilling those shelf pin holes. So let me show you the hardware on the base cabinets next. So on the base cabinets, I have a few different types of hardware depending on the exact base cabinet. This is gonna be a drawer base, so it'll have 3 sets of drawer slides in it. And then I'll also need to drill the holes for those leveling feet I'm gonna be installing. And once again, I'm gonna be using a bunch of jigs to do this. And if there's anything to take away from this, when you're doing any sort of hardware stuff on cabinetry, invest in some good quality jigs because they're gonna save you a ton of time. And I have an absolute ton of jigs for all the different cabinet making hardware processes, and it makes things go so much more quickly, and it ensures that everything's gonna be done really accurately. So let's start with drilling the holes for the drawer slides. So this is the jig I typically use for installing my drawer slides, and you can also use this jig for installing your hinges. This is made by Blum, who manufactures a lot of this hardware. This thing's a little on the expensive side, but it's super well made and extremely versatile. So if you install a lot of this kind of hardware, you might consider taking a look at it. So these are the slides I'm gonna be using. These are actually Rockler's version, essentially, of these Blum undermount slides, but the first set of slides on the bottom here is gonna be essentially just slammed up against the bottom of the cabinet. And so to drill the mounting holes for this, I can take my Blum jig, set it on the front edge here,
And then I have the corresponding 5mm drill bit that comes with this jig. As you can see, the drill bit has a little stop collar on it so I don't drill all the way through the side of my cabinets, which would be bad. And then I can just drill out a handful of these holes. And so as I mentioned, these are 5mm holes, and that's because with these drawer slides, I like to use what are called system screws. These are 5mm screws. They're a lot chunkier than the screws that usually come with this kind of hardware, and they have a lot more holding power, especially if you're gonna be adding and removing the screws over and over again. So the only downside of this jig is it's obviously not that long, so I will have to come back and drill this last hole, but that's pretty simple. I can just take my 5mm bit. And there's my drawer slide installed, and all I would need to do for the rest of the drawers is measure up, mark a center line, and then repeat the process. So then the last bit of hardware I install on these base cabinets are these leveling feet. And so these things are awesome because it's just a piece of plastic. You've got your base, which sets into a hole that's drilled in the bottom of the base cabinet itself. Then you've got your feet. And then as you can see, all you have to do is turn these feet to extend or retract them, and you can level your cabinets in a matter of seconds. It's a really great system. I have made yet another jig for drilling this hole because it needs to be set back a certain distance from the front edge. And then I have this monster drill bit to drill the actual holes. So obviously you'd screw this base plate in place, but then once that's done, you just slip the leg into the base plate and it's good to go. And I used to install 4 of these rather than just the 2 on the front, but these are not particularly cheap, and I think it's actually a lot easier to just install that ledger board on your wall, set the back edge of the cabinets on that, and then use these leveling feet to both level the cabinets, but then it's also where you attach your toe kick using the included clips. I'll have links to all the tools and materials I used in this video in the video description below. If it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. And last, why not check out this playlist of some of the other cabinetry projects I've done here on the channel. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.